Start this event. Thank you all so much for being here and attending this event organized by ARGO, the Advisory Council on Gender and Development in Belgium. And this event will tackle the gender-based violence and climate as a double threat to our society. And without further ado, I can already introduce a representative of the council itself here in Egypt, Viviane Teitelboom. She is a representative, but also the president of the Working Group on Gender-Based Violence, who will now provide the introduction to this event.
Thank you, Kiki. Hello to all, and thank you for being here, and a special thanks for our special rapporteur for joining us on a last-minute basis. And so I would like to introduce to you the Advisory Council of Gender and Development. We have a mission that is established by a royal decree in 2014. And what we do is we contribute to this decision of the Belgian Minister of Development and Cooperation and the federal government regarding gender and development. We have an advisory role, so for ensuring better integration of gender in Belgian development policy and fueling the positions that Belgium takes on an international level. How do we do that? We bring together the expertise of Dutch and French-speaking experts in the academia, from the Women's Council, French and Dutch-speaking women councils, but also from the NGOs and from the Institute for the Equality Between Men and Women. That's how we work together. So how do we function? We have annual meetings with the minister to exchange on our action plan, and then we have plenary sessions every 2 months. There we approve our advisory notes, like the one I will present to you today. We also review the actions that are carried out by the working groups, and we review what the minister does with our advisory notes. So we have different working groups. We have a working group on gender, climate, and agriculture. We have a working group on gender-based violence. Those two working groups have actually worked together to prepare this advisory note in light of the COP. And we also have a working group that works on gender issues, and we take positions on different international points or in different, in light of what is going on in the international agenda. We do also in-depth studies on different themes, and we, of course, are open to external experts. So, in light of this COP, we hosted a webinar last May from the two working groups to debrief on the decisions that were taken by the CSW 66 and to demonstrate the connections between gender, violence, and climate. And based on the context of this webinar and drawing on the input from experts from the Advisory Council, we formulated an advice on the connections between gender-based violence and climate. So I wanted to say a few words very rapidly on how the connections work between gender-based violence and the climate in our advisory notes. So as I said, we based our note on the 66th Commission on the Status of Women, but also on the 6th Assessment Report of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we did that to inform and raise awareness among Belgian policymakers and actors about the connections between gender and climate in the context of different discussions that were held. This is why this advice is important, and this is why we have a main message in a few points that I will convey to you. First, the climate crisis is increasing sexual and sexist violence. Girls and women are often placed in vulnerable and dangerous situations as a result of environmental issues and natural disasters. It's of course also a result of COVID, of patriarchal structures, racism, and other harmful practices. But climate change policies operate within those oppressive structures which can inadvertently or not reinforce them. And despite the link between gender and climate crisis, many climate plans are still gender blind. So they remain gender blind, and yet women and girls have been at the forefront of social movements for climate and environmental justice, and they are still absent from decision-making process. CSW, which has recognized their role, encourages measures to prevent and protect them and create a safer environment. That's why we made a few recommendations, which I want to share with you. First of all, our advisory council calls for recognizing the links between climate challenges and gender-based violence in policies, in fostering participation, in providing political and financial support, in investing in prevention and protection, and prosecuting perpetrators, but also to collect data. We make the fight against climate change also a fight against gender-based violence. Conduct a climate transformation policy and establish programs based on gender transformative models. That's important. Therefore, we ask to grant and to increase gender-responsive funding. We request the IPCC to produce a special report on the links between gender and climate, both in the context of adaptation and mitigation, in relation to including specific links with sexual and sexist violence. We think this is a very important point. We need to have, therefore, a double approach to gender in the global stocktake during this COP. We need to call on countries to ratify and apply the various international instruments that contribute to the fight against gender-based violence. We need to integrate gender-based violence and sexual intimidation as serious risks of human rights violations, which must be avoided, resolved, and remedied. And we need to make a gender-sensitive human rights and environment impact assessments. That's why we have demands to continue to provide political and financial support to the work of peaceful and democratic civil organizations, including feminist organizations, women and indigenous movements, and maintain a close dialogue with them, and explicitly condemn any attempt to muzzle them, with particular attention to gender-based violence. Integrate a gender perspective in the creation of a safe and favorable climate for the defense of human and women's rights, and prevent discrimination, violences, and abuses. Increase the share of bilateral and multilateral financing. Ensure that climate finance is monitored and reported against gender indicators. Finally, we need to invest in prevention and protection, to continue to be an active advocate of the Council Resolution 1325, and hold national companies operating abroad accountable. Also collect data to have qualitative efficiency. All these recommendations are of essence, and we really do hope that the Belgian government will pay attention to it. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you, Viviane, for the presentation of the Council, but also already giving an overview of the state of play and some of the recommendations, so we can really dive into the details and the more political issues even later on. I'm honored to present right now also the Special Rapporteur on Gender-Based Violence from the UN, Ms. Reem Al-Salam. She recently in July also published a report that really unpacks the linkages between climate change, displacement, slow onset events, and gender-based violence. And she's also really active on solutions and good practices. So I give the floor now to the Special Rapporteur. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. For those who don't know what a Special Rapporteur is, we're actually independent experts. We're actually not UN staff. We are accountable and appointed by the Human Rights Council of the UN precisely for our expertise. With that in mind, I can also choose the issues that I want to focus on when it comes to my thematic reports to the Council. and to the General Assembly, which I have to produce once every year. And in fact, I'm very, very pleased that you organized the session on this issue, precisely because I feel it has not received the attention that it deserves. What we've heard about a lot is talk about gender equality and climate change, which of course is important, but it's not the same as gender-based violence, and it's not the same as violence against women and girls. So I'm very pleased that you're also asking the Belgian government and other governments to focus on this more. And in fact, you've mentioned all the main issues and recommendations, so I feel I have very little left to say because if only to echo what you have said. Through this report, actually, which I produced in July and presented in October to the General Assembly, one main conclusion comes out, and it's very clear beyond the shadow of a doubt that despite the fact that maybe hard data is missing, the data we have is sufficient to tell us that the impact of climate change is undeniably gendered. It undeniably exacerbates violence against women and girls in all their diversity, and it undeniably affects their fundamental human rights. And it's also experienced really differently by women and girls than men and boys. And when I say it exacerbates violence against women and girls, which is the mandate I have, I'm talking about all forms of violence, so physical violence, which includes, of course, sexual violence, but also the lesser known forms of violence, so economic violence, psychological violence. It impacts the sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls and their access to these services. And in the report, I provide many examples of that. Now, I looked at natural disasters and sort of the big crises that happen on the spur of a moment, but I also tried to look at the slow onset of disasters and environmental degradation, which is actually more challenging because we have less data on it. So if we think about the sort of disasters that we see in the news, so cyclones, hurricanes, earthquakes, one of the actually quite evident forms of violence they experience is when they go to shelters which are not really equipped to host women and girls. They don't have privacy, there is no lighting, sometimes there is no separation of men and boys, and so that leads to increase in sexual violence, in rape, but also there is a breakdown of identification and reporting mechanisms and follow-up mechanisms. And we have to, of course, remember that many of these disasters happen in countries that already have very fragile systems, including fragile or even incomplete policies and strategies to deal with violence against women and girls. And then you now bring a really massive disaster on top of that. So really, it makes a lot of things a lot worse. Also, what we see is the loss of livelihood in rural areas, in traditional societies, amongst indigenous communities. That forces women and girls into sexual exploitation in exchange for food and natural resources. Also, when there's water scarcity from droughts, that pushes women and girls to travel longer distances, so they go into further unfamiliar areas or territories without safeguards. I'm glad you talked about actually the role of industries as well, because we think traditionally of the responsibility of governments in upholding safety of people, of individuals, of women and girls. But actually what this report also has shown is that companies, especially those that are involved in extractive industries and that pollute the environment and that arrive in territories, bringing with them also often their security apparatus. And we have to remember that many of them are predominantly manned by men. So that brings with it a host of problems, especially for the women and girls. So it brings in issues of sexual exploitation, of trafficking, of prostitution, and with very little accountability. because of course it's harder to hold companies accountable for human rights violations. And if I have one recommendation, is that we have to really develop binding treaties that hold companies accountable for their conduct. One other thing that we perhaps don't know very much about when it comes to the climate crisis is the extent to which it had intensified conflicts over land. And there also, women and girls get disadvantaged. So their use of land that they are entitled to, the ownership of land becomes even harder to protect. And what we see is also often traditional leaders, but also authorities, push women away from the land that they are entitled to. They force them off the land and they strip them away from this ownership. I did speak about psychological forms of violence, and there are studies that show that because of the climate crisis, women and girls experience depression, experience anxiety because of the repercussions. They suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, either directly or indirectly because of climate change. And this stress disorder can come because of this reduced privacy I spoke about. There's been studies done with women that are in shelters, and it is a very serious problem for them not to be able to enjoy privacy. Funnily enough, the climate crisis has also impacted the violence women and girls experience at homes. We already know that domestic violence is a very serious issue. In some countries, of course, it's higher than others, but it's made, let's say, household tasks more intensive, and we know household tasks in many countries are unpaid. It has exacerbated domestic violence. It has increased the burden on women, especially if the males in the family tend to migrate, leaving women and children behind in order to find livelihood, because the livelihoods they used to do are not sustainable anymore. So overall, that has really led to an increase in the household work of women, in the increase of the economic burden, and also has reduced their financial independence. Now, with all these economic problems, we see women and girls then turning to negative coping mechanisms, so turning to sex work, turning, unfortunately, to also child marriages as a coping mechanism. We see them venturing into kinds of works in urban centers that are more risky and that offer less protection. Now, in the report, I also speak about groups of women and girls that are more prone to, let's say, violence because of the climate crisis, like indigenous women and girls, which you mentioned. Older women also are more prone to the consequences of the climate crisis because they are not kept in mind, either in the policies that target their needs. They're often forgotten. They're often also not thought of as a group of women that can contribute to finding solutions. Also in women environmental human rights defenders, and of course women of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. In my report, I mentioned an example in one country where LBT women are turned away, or LBTI persons are turned away, because it's seen that God basically sent his wrath upon the area because we allowed our societies to entertain persons that are not straight or not cis. Women with disabilities are often also victims of policies that look at climate change because they don't take into account that there are persons with disabilities. In terms of sort of recommendations, I want to leave you with one thought, which is that really it brings back the realization that we have to have comprehensive policies to address the issue of climate change and its nexus to violence. So we have to really do several things at the same time. We cannot just focus on one segment in terms of policies. We cannot have a piecemeal approach. It has to be human rights centered, and it has to go just beyond emphasizing the participation of women, which is important, and they need to have them at the decision-making table. We have to really provide gender-responsive climate financing, which means really making sure that this financing reaches women organizations, civil society, grassroots organizations at the very local level. And we have to also recognize the differentiated impact and vulnerabilities that I spoke about. And what you just said is very true in the sense that violence against women, even before the climate crisis, doesn't happen in isolation, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within systems, discriminatory systems, economic, political, legal systems that discriminate against women and girls. And we have to use the response to the climate crisis now in order really to dismantle and really transform these systems so that they really can become more participatory, more inclusive, more earth-sensitive, more transformative, and we have to really have systems in place that are really more just and fair and sustainable. Because, of course, that also then will, on its own, address the issue of violence against women. And finally, I would say that it's very important to address the issue of livelihood and resilience. In fact, the majority of poor persons in the world are women, are rural women, are indigenous women, so we have to really address their survival, their livelihood issue, their access to resources, and their access and participation in the green economy. Yeah, so not just their own. We have to also increase investment in social protection systems. And finally, I would say to really end this impunity for violence that is rampant against women, including that perpetrated by the private sector. So there's a lot of things that need to be done simultaneously. And you know, my final call is really to not allow, especially in the COP right now, but also for future COP, the issue of the rights of women to be hijacked for political posturing, for political positions, for political stands, because we always see that the first victim of that is women's rights. When states want to, you know, have political, raise political issues, the first one to suffer is the rights of women and girls, and that has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima Salam. It really struck me that you said rarely any mentioning of violence in the climate plans and the intersection. So I think it's also necessary to talk about it more, and that's why we have an amazing panel on experts coming up next, and we'll explore the nexus between violence, gender, and climate. So I'm really honored to present as well here Professor Nili Nagabadla from the United Nations University, and she's a senior research fellow in climate change and natural resources. And we also have following and participating online Colette Solomon, and she's the director of the Women on Farms. So please, Professor Nagabadla, if you're ready, I would like to give you.
Thank you, Kiki. As the slides come up, let me take the opportunity to thank the organizers for giving me the stage to share my insights on this very topical issue, and my panelists for setting the tone of the discourse. As I wait for my presentation to be on the screen, I want you to walk through this vicious cycle of gender inequality in the development research, including in climate research. And we need to strive, co-create solutions to turn these vicious circles into virtuous loops. And how can we do that? I think there are several modalities I want to explain in my presentation. And let me see if it goes right. And well, let me start with an agreement. Please raise your hand if we all agree that climate change is responsible for gender and sexual violence. Raise your hand. So we agree first. Then we start taking some action on it. First we have to agree. That's the first step number one. Step two, let's see what other experts are saying who also agree with us. The CARE International Director from the Netherlands. She says that yes, we have had enough talk. We have done the diagnostics. Let's turn our theory into action now. And with that, those words from her, I want to bring this thought to the floor. So let's figure out what we can do in terms of our research, in terms of the data, information, knowledge that we carry as experts, as institutions, as states, as communities who can bring this agenda at the forefront. Also, I want to also talk a little bit about the work that UN is doing, just compressed in one slide. UN is also taking note of this gap, if I may, to see what are the modalities through which these gaps can be, these bridges can be built in the ongoing interventions for gender equality. SDG 5 is one such modality, but also understanding the narratives, the stories that my co-panelists just shared. These interventions have to be very context specific. What may apply to Europe may not apply to Africa. So we can't give a blueprint of gender equality to the world. We have to give some context specific and fitting solutions that may apply to socio-cultural realities, that may apply to socio-political complexities. Also a little summary of when we talk about gender-based violence within the climate change impact, they are manifested in different ways, and you can see a summary here. I won't repeat. My panelists did this great job of explaining you the context, but the idea is to understand and deconstruct that to a particular context, to a setting, to the kind of society. So I think this is a spectrum of how these challenges are manifested. Let's not forget that COVID has given us some new set of challenges in this space. Let me give you one data. In 2021, for between the age of 25 to 35 age group, for each 100 men, there were around 118 women who live in extreme poverty of less than $2 a day. And by 2050, the projections show that for each 100 men, there will be 120 women. You can see what stats and data is taking us to. This is certainly not good news. But the good news is that we, as the UN agency, as states, as communities, as intellectuals who care about these issues have done some good homework. They have given us mechanisms, they have given us thought process, they have given us entry points to address this challenge. One such entry point, and I again want to raise a hand. How many in the room knows about the Beijing Declaration? The Beijing Declaration, okay, so we know about the Beijing Declaration. Well, that's good news. When I used to teach water and gender in my class to the students, out of 100, I only saw 2 hands, so I'm so glad. So I think we need to also fill the education gaps of taking the knowledge we have on gender equality to our education. Well, I'll come to that. But in terms of the identified priorities, we know livelihood, education, health, security, shelter, that was outlined in the Beijing Declaration. And since 1975, UN has had only 4 world conferences on women in Mexico, Copenhagen, Nairobi, and Beijing. And Beijing was a milestone with Beijing Declaration, what the agenda on equality, development, peace, understanding roles of women in public spaces, in household spaces, and it had the word urgent in there. And still, down the lane, we are still calling this matter urgent. Have we done enough? We need to ask ourselves as experts, institutions, and states who care about these issues. Well, look at the fine action agenda the Beijing Declaration gave us. It's been 25 years. Let's look at it again. Let's give it a minute and look at it again. Maybe we have made progress, but violence against women was very much there. And still, when we see the data, we see the information, we see that we still have to do a lot. We are still on ground zero. Why do I say that? Because when we talk about educated, intellectual women who are aware of their rights, you see the gender inequality, how they are represented in different different spheres of public spaces. All is not bad news. We are getting there, but very slowly. We need to speed up. SDG 5 has given us at least a blueprint on how to reach there, and that alignment to the climate discourse could be one of our pathways. MDG, I'm sure I remember it very well because that was instrumental for me to decide to do a PhD on MDGs, focusing on how the world has started thinking together about challenges of humanity. This is not anymore a challenge of Bangladesh or Somalia. This is something we have to do collectively, and MDGs was the start point of that collective thinking. The good point, it had a dedicated focus on gender equality. And here, SDG comes 2015, SDG portfolio has given a special placeholder for focusing on gender equality, SDG 6, but we know that if we don't fill those gaps, if we don't assess the needs in context-specific situations, we are not implementing any of these nice SDGs listed on the screen. SDG 5, very reflective, maybe not overly comprehensive, a good start point for communities and states to outline their agenda for integration in different sectors, be it climate, be it water management, land management, rights, and social justice. And I see that it's been doing its job. Worldwide, there is aggregation of terms that speak to gaps in gender justice, the gender equality tag that Beijing Plus 25 put out there to align to speak to regions, to speak to communities, and the set of indicators. And indicators, as a scientist to me, are a good way to at least measure some level of success, to do some kind of comparative context. So I think these are the tools. I'm focusing on how to move forward. We have done our homework. We know there are problems. But now let's leverage from what the states are already doing. Let's plug in. Let's kind of do that integration exercise more seriously. And after the Beijing report, when I did a sort of a review of how this has been integrated, even non-conventional states like the Arab region, like China and Nepal, have had their own national plans of building on the Beijing Declaration. Well, this is certainly good news also for the climate-related impacts that are leading to gender inequality or gender-based violence. And here are some information from the UN and other stakeholders who are giving us those details to outline concepts, to create frameworks, to understand how to kind of create agendas that are again suiting the context. We did at UN, we did so taking into account also the migration context, as my co-panelist said, that migration in the sense has its own space in the international development discourse, and so in the climate policy discourse, but also making a case in the health sector, so understanding intersections, interlinkages, and trying to address them through policy coherence dialogue. And one of the interesting things we noted was that we talk about climate change, we talk about compounding risk and impacts, disaster and humanitarian crisis come up front. So these are spaces where the gender equalities can be sometimes very blaring. And when you see, when we try to understand how the humanitarian kits are composed, the composition of the kits that people in crisis receive, we noted the following. So please follow the green color on these world maps from 2016, 17, 18. The green color is an indicator that these humanitarian kits were developed with a gender-sensitive lens. They did have those things that are needed for women and girls, like menstrual health products. And the red is something that was totally missing. So I think these are the gaps that we wanted to highlight, how humanitarian response is constructed. And we also are working with engineers, because when you work with technology, you have to work with engineers to design gender-sensitive products. So the UN 75 was a kind of a landmark to discuss this with that unconventional group, to bring them on board. Because when you talk about different livelihoods, you talk about different hardware and software that women have to use if they are the head of the household. For example, a tractor. A female farmer can't use the same tractor as a men farmer. So these are very nuanced things that sometimes fall off the crack, but I think these have to be brought back into the discourse and the solution discussions that we have. And I'm going to conclude by sharing a toolkit that we developed in collaboration with UNESCO, the Gender and the Water Toolkit. There could be a similar toolkit for the Gender and the Climate Violence Addressing Toolkit. What's interesting about this toolkit? This toolkit has managed to collect set of indicators already being applied and operational in different states around the world, a set of 105 indicators in 10 different topics, and the topics are listed here. And these indicators are given back to the member states to outline their own agenda, to own indicators set to monitor and kind of report. And through that report, we are able to refine and reform policies because we can understand gaps. Well, I think I'll leave you with that.
Thanks, Professor. I think that was very interesting to have a special toolkit also presented and learning lessons and exchanging. Yeah, it's really hard to hear sometimes. I'm sorry. I would like to give the floor now to Colette Solomon, Director of Women on Farms. Colette, are you ready to provide your presentation? Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to start just by thanking our Belgian partner FOSS for this kind invitation to be part of this discussion all the way from South Africa. The Women on Farms project is a feminist that works with women who work on commercial wine farms in South Africa. A central part of our work, central part of our work is on gender-based violence, and we deal with it obviously as a cross-cutting, intersecting focus of our work. Taking cognizance of the fact that for women who work on farms and live on farms, there are multiple and complex and intersecting and compounding causes and underlying structures that include, for example, our history of colonization, our history of apartheid, South African women's lack of land, and also the context-specific forms and manifestations of patriarchy and masculinities as they manifest specifically in South Africa and in the farm worker context. So taking account of the fact that there are these multiple causes of gender-based violence, recently, however, in the recent years, increasingly, we are also seeing how climate change is also presenting a new and growing contributory cause to gender-based violence and exacerbating the gender inequalities in the household and in society, and thereby contributing to gender-based violence in farm worker communities. So as Women on Farms project, we have identified at least two main pathways whereby climate change increases women's vulnerability and exposure to gender-based violence and risk to gender-based violence. So the three pathways are women's employment, women's tenure on farms, and household food security. And I will take you through each of those pathways now and also provide some examples from women on in these different pathways. So when we're looking at an issue like women's employment, increasingly with climate change, farm workers are reporting that the seasons on farms are much more unpredictable. That obviously leads to work on farms more unpredictable, especially for women who are seasonal farm workers. So if the season and the growing season and the harvest season are shorter and unpredictable, this obviously has an impact on the availability of work and also the availability and the amount of income and earnings that women are able to derive from employment on farms. And when a woman when a woman makes a less contribution to the household pot, her status in the household, her ability to make decisions, her power in the household also declines as a result. And there's obviously those together with greater financial vulnerability and greater exposure or vulnerability to gender-based violence in the household as her dependence on her male partner increases. And we can see that women's control in the household is directly related to the employment position and to the economic and financial contribution which they make to the household. So as we see from some of the quotations that women have reported to us in different contexts, that, for example, the first quotation, one can clearly see women referring to how the seasons have changed, how they are more unpredictable. And obviously this has an impact on the growing season and women's employment on farms. In the last season, 2021-2022, many women were sent home without working, without payment, because the grape was simply not ready for harvesting. And when I said that the last season they therefore earned less, and they were able to make less contribution to the household income, and therefore the power dynamic, the power balance in the household clearly shifted as a result. So the second pathway that we want to look at is women's tenure on farms. So in this Pan-African context, women have the right to live on the farm by virtue of working on the farm. And so when women lose their work, they lose their tenure on farms, and that always inevitably leads to farm worker families, women and their children, being evicted from farms. And this then leads them to be moved to informal settlements, which expose them to new and additional risks of gender-based violence. For example, many of the informal settlements, they have very poor lighting, there are communal toilets, high poverty, high unemployment, gangsterism, high alcohol and drug abuse incidents, and so on. So women and girl children are actually more vulnerable in informal settlements than they were when living, peacefully on a quiet, remote farm in a very secluded and a relatively safe environment with other farm workers. So we at Women on Farms Project have been working with a community that were evicted from a farm in 2015, and one of the saddest stories was when a 16-year-old girl disappeared and later was found raped, killed, and her burned. And of course, the community has said that if they had not been evicted from the farm, if they had not ended up in an informal settlement, she would still be alive today. So we see that the direct link when women lose their jobs, women lose their tenure on farms, this exposes them to new risks, not only intimate partner violence, but violence that comes from being in an environment that is already has a high crime incidence and violence incidence. So lastly, looking at the pathway of household food security, as I've said, women have reduced earnings because the seasons are affected. But women's produce from food gardens are also obviously affected by high temperatures, unseasonal rains, and so on. And so are able to, because they don't have the same income, they are less able to buy enough food for the household, and less able to grow enough food and contribute to the household. And this also leads to increased domestic tensions, and also then increases women's vulnerability in the house from already in the past few years. So Women in Farms Project supports women start ecological food gardens to address seasonal insecurity and also to address seasonality of their work on farms. And already women have been reporting how the unpredictability of the erratic weather that they've been experiencing has directly affected their own produce from their own food gardens. And this is very important because not only does it affect what they're able to, again, contribute to the household part, but it also affects their ability to generate supplementary income from the produce that they're able to sell from their food gardens. So in conclusion then, if we look at the three pathways by which climate change exacerbates and introduces new sources of gender-based violence for women who live on farms, we can see that these three pathways, of course, they are all interlinked and interrelated, and they quite clearly show us that going forward, I mean, it's almost too banal to say, but it is absolutely imperative that the climate change discourse and gender and the just transition discourses and policy around them must be changed in the first place. But we also can see that there needs to be a context-specific responsiveness to the different vulnerabilities and the different insecurities and precarity that women will face as a result of climate change. This case study presents the very context-specific situation of women farm workers, and it clearly therefore shows that proactive, preventative interventions are going to be needed around women's employment, around women's tenure, the landlessness, household food security, and so on. So there needs to be proactive prevention of women's exposure to the ravages of climate change, and therefore we're saying that going forward, policy, both our own government policies and interventions must be proactive and must address these context specificities, but also oversee development aid and policies and interventions should also take account of the context-specific threats and vulnerabilities that different groups of women in the global south, like farm workers, are exposed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colette. Super inspiring to see that women are not only vulnerable, but that the solution also lies in women mobilizing and agroecology. And we heard some different proposals on different levels, but we haven't touched upon the political or the policy level, and that's why we also invited to cabinet workers when Alexander Verstraete of the Minister of Development Cooperation, Mariam Kittir, and also participating online Katarzyna Tsuka from the State Secretary Sarah Schlitz of Gender Inequality. And I was very honored to give the floor now to the next speaker, Alexander Verstraete.
Thank you very much, Kiki. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for the previous interventions, because it was super interesting to hear those perspectives. Today we are discussing two very severe topics. The previous speakers have already highlighted the issues that are at stake. Gender-based violence, it's an absolute horror that we are faced with all too often. We talk about it here at this side event at COP, but we probably all know people in our own personal circles who have been faced with a terrifying experience of sexual intimidation or violence. And then the many people who are here at this event, also in your professional contexts, most of us are confronted with reports on violence against women. At the Belgian Development Corporation, we have 14 partner countries. Those are 13 countries in Africa, in the Sahel region, in Central Africa, and also in Palestine. And from some of these countries, all too often we have those kind of reports emerging, of murders, of rape, of other forms of sexual violence against women. For example, once again now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the east they are again faced with armed conflict. And again, tens of thousands of people are fleeing their homes, and reports are again reaching us of human rights violations, and obviously women are again at danger of gender-related violence. And it's revolting to again hear all this news, to see that local communities are again falling apart there, and that we as human society we're failing to protect the most vulnerable that are living there. Yet as the Nobel Prize winner Dr. Mukwege, the director of the Panzi Hospital in Bukavu, likes to say often, saving a woman is saving a nation. I would say let's take up this challenge here of gender-based violence very seriously, and let's try to indeed save our nations, our societies from the scourge of gender-based violence. And that's also why I would like to take a bit more a forward-looking perspective in my intervention, because we know that climate change has a more severe impact, has a more severe impact on women. I think the previous interventions have made that very clear, and the reports that have been written by the Special Rapporteur has made that very clear as well. And we also know that the fight against climate change, it's one that requires that we at conference like this here at COP, we need to take a transformative approach. It's a way of saying that we often have here at the COP, but it's true. So I would like to applaud the organizers of this event here today, and for putting forward the link between climate change and gender-based violence. And let's talk indeed how we can take transformative approaches to tackle these challenges. It is indeed a double threat to gender equality, climate change, as was mentioned in the report by Argo. It's an excruciating one even, but let's take up that challenge and do the right thing and try to change pre-existing gender stereotypes in our societies. I was given the opportunity last year to also speak at the event of CCGD Argo, and at that occasion I provided further detail on how Minister Kittir integrated the gender-responsive approach in the then recently announced Sahel Climate Partnership. There was a partnership, or it's a partnership, that Belgium has concluded with 4 countries in the Sahel: Senegal, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. It's executed by the Belgian Development Agency, ENABEL. More generally, it will benefit 650,000 people, and 40,000 hectares of land will be restored over a period of 5 years. But more importantly, in that partnership we're also looking at a gender-responsive approach. 40 to 50% of the land that will be restored through that partnership will be allocated to women. So talking about tenure rights, that's really something we want to tackle there. And each of Senegal and in Niger, we will be working with, or ENABEL is currently working with 200 women's groups who are involved in the partnership and who will be involved also at the policy level in those countries. And in total, I mean, there's many more things, but there's 24 gender-specific indicators included in the program. So it's really something that we try to include as much as possible. And then having that transformative approach to break the currently socioeconomically speaking vulnerable situation of women in that region. It's also taken up in the Belgian pledge towards the Coalition for Feminist Action for Climate Justice of the Gender Equality Forum. So voilà, that is the Sahel partnership. But now I will also want to give a bit more detail on a new partnership that we have recently announced. It's the partnership with Mozambique. Minister Van den Broeke has announced it last week. It's a partnership that is implemented by Enabel. It also has a duration of 5 years with a budget of 25 million euros, focused completely on climate change, of all aspects of climate change. And part of that partnership will be on loss and damage as well. There's a budget of 2.5 million euros that is dedicated to loss and damage, and it's really it's in the loss and damage aspects on these climate disasters that the impact of gender-based violence is really happening. And it's also through this partnership that we will try to really have an impact there and have a transformative impact there on those challenges. I mean, maybe just a bit more in general. Obviously, loss and damage is a major topic here at the COP, and I think we all need to acknowledge, we as Western countries, we need to deliver on that topic. Definitely for the climate vulnerable countries like Mozambique. Climate catastrophes are also a particular concern for women in terms of fatalities, gender-based violence, the loss of livelihoods, healthcare, education. It's all been mentioned already by the previous intervention. And so I would like to mention three ways in which the partnership in Mozambique will take action on that gender and climate nexus, or gender-based violence and climate nexus. Firstly, we'll want to try to better identify and prioritize the impacts and the need of women in the aftermath of climate disaster, to have a better mapping of what are really the needs and what is really the impact that is happening there. And secondly, once that is done, that mapping, we will integrate concrete measures in the disaster recovery framework. For example, in terms of safety concerns, working on separate sanitation facilities for men and women that were also mentioned before, in the temporary settlements that are obviously crucial, but also in terms of ensuring enforcement of prosecution of perpetrators of gender-based violence, working with the authorities to see how we can make that happen. And also in terms of providing specific counseling for survivors of gender-based violence, trying to also have that integrated there in the entire framework and strategies of Mozambique at the national and at the local level. And thirdly, the third point on which we will be working through that partnership for the next 5 years is, and that is really, I think, the most important and transformative way to work, is wanting to support the engagement of women and youth in policy dialogue on loss and damage at all levels of the government, not only at the local level, but also at the national and the international level, so that in that way we can really try to ensure that the policy leaders will be working on that, and will make the change that is necessary. We have a gender focus throughout the entire program. I just focus now on the loss and damage aspects of it. It will also be coming back in all the other pillars of the program. For example, when setting up early warning systems, we will take into account the risks that women face there. We will be looking at, I mean, if women do not have access to mobile phones, then obviously they will not be receiving the early warnings that will be sent out through the early warning systems. So when setting up these early warning systems, we need to think about these, about those aspects. The same about when setting up financial mechanisms. We need to take into account when we set up social security schemes that there's these pre-existing male-dominated socioeconomic situations that we need to tackle as well. So if we set up these social security systems, we need to take into account that specific situation of women. So just in general, the gender policy is really at the heart of the work of Enabel in the Mozambique program. I think it's also a moral duty of us. I mean, we're talking about 50% of society, and we're in the 21st century, and still far too often women are confronted with gender-based violence, and it's also something that, as a man, I think, as we are not often enough aware of that gender-based violence and intimidation that is happening, whether it's close to home or the other side of the planet. So I think it's very important that we're talking about this here today. And I also want to show that indeed the Belgian government, we are working on this as well through the development cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alexander. Katarzyna, are you ready to provide your presentation?
Thank you. Do you hear me well?
Are you ready to start your presentation?
Yes, yes, I'm fine.
Perfect.
Thank you. I feel very privileged to participate in this event and represent the Office of the State Secretary, Sarah Schlitz, who couldn't unfortunately be here personally. But I will have a brief on new perspectives and insights after the event, and I would also take this opportunity to thank the Belgian Advisory Council for their precious advice and engagement, and also the organizers for putting together a lineup of high-level experts. It was a very good set of the scene, and we had already a lot of excellent contributions, so I will try to add something to this already very full picture by describing on how the Belgian federal policy tries to bring its part of the answer to these pressing issues. Alexander spoke already about loss and damages importance and the Belgian contribution to it, but as a north-south inequality of climate crisis, we have also had speakers talking about the gendered contribution to the climate crisis and the gendered effect on women and girls. This event, and it was already mentioned by Viviane, ties also to the theme of the last Commission on the Status of Women that took place in March at the UN, and we had a very interesting side event. Minister Katabi and State Secretary Schlitz hosted it together with Ministers of Environment of Maldives and Costa Rica. About the climate crisis is not gender neutral, and we had also Professor Anyan Prakash, the co-author of the Gender Cross chapter box in the last IPCC report. So, as already mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Arsalan, why climate crisis and environmental degradation affect the entire global population, we see that their consequences only exacerbate existing gender inequalities and affect disproportionately women and girls in all their diversity. So what we have witnesses already is that climate refugees add up to refugees fleeing war and conflicts, and their vulnerability exposes them even more to violence, including sexual violence. And we already know that 80% of those displaced by climate crisis are women and girls. But we have to also speak openly about the fact that gender-based violence and sexual violence is increasing with those events, and we talked a bit about violence in camps, the domestic violence, but also child marriages as a cause for family financial situation, human trafficking, as well as sexual violence as a result of presence of army forces and rogue forces. But I would like to mention in my intervention a couple of instruments that we do locally in Belgium, but also as international and European policy. So the State Secretary, Sarah Schlitz, always insisted how proud she is being a member of the first gender-equal Belgian government. And this would not have been possible without the legislation in place, including the quotas on the electoral lists. Because we need the equal representation on every level. We never have a gender-sensitive response to the climate crisis we are facing if we don't have women and girls speaking about it and being at the table. So Minister Katabi, who is at the COP as well, is the Belgian Minister for Climate, working very effectively on just transition policy, is one of the 15% of women ministers of environment and climate. So we still have a long way to go. And of course, we should arrive at this equal representation for the sake of gender equality, but also because we can benefit from the specific knowledge and experience of women and girls, and this also includes a specific stress on equality, on inclusion of indigenous women and girls. What we need also equal representation for experts, officials, and a free, diverse, and thriving civil society. What we have done in Belgium is that the State Secretary launched a civil society platform that was tasked with monitoring her plan against gender-based violence, and she guaranteed a specific budget for participating NGOs. As we see in many cases, NGOs are mainly providing government with free advice, while at the same time consultancy is being paid for it. At the horizontal level, Belgium also masters gender mainstream approach, and this includes, of course, environmental and climate policies. We have a federal gender mainstream plan that was coordinated by the State Secretary and put in place in the collaboration of the civil society. And we have more than 150 measures, and many of them are linked directly to development aid and climate, and some of them were mentioned there by Alexander. And in this context as well, Belgium adopted the fourth national plan as a follow-up on the landmark resolution of Women, Peace and Security that recognizes that gender-based violence, including sexual violence, should be seen and responded to with several means. And we encourage all countries to follow up on the resolution and join forces in the international response. Nationally, Belgium is very proud of its holistic national plan against gender-based violence that includes also international European responses, and it's fully compliant with another landmark international instrument, the Istanbul Convention, and also developed with hand in hand with civil society. As regards to victims of sexual violence, Belgium is applying a victim-centered approach at our territory. It comprises medical and psychological care, access to forensic examination, and assistance of trained police inspectors. We need international efforts to apply this approach globally, and we are open to share our model with interested parties. We have done it already with the practitioners from Ukraine who are willing to set up a similar model in response to conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated in the frame of the Russian aggression of Ukraine, but Belgium works also with the Global Surveillance Fund to provide access to reparations for survivors across the globe. What we should stress as well is that Belgium is very vocal about the situation of women rights defenders as a part of larger set of civil society organizations. This is especially important given that they often risk their lives and health protecting our democracy environment. And the State Secretary seeks every opportunity to exchange with women and girls that are inspiring actors of change. Professor Nilvina Batla mentioned the context-specific situation of gender equality and hence gender-sensitive response. And Colette Solomon, thank you for this very tangible perspective of women farmers and bringing the intersected perspective of racism and patriarchy in a very specific context. What the State Secretary Sarah Schlitz always strives to include in all her policies in an intersectional perspective. And as we should all repeat every time, climate crisis has a greater impact on people in vulnerable situations, sometimes with cognitive risk, and we need to know how to shield people that will suffer the most from the consequences given their specific vulnerabilities. As already the Special Rapporteur said, being a woman with a migration background, part of the LGBTI community, or having a handicap increases this vulnerability and exposes women and girls to intersecting discrimination. Finally, Belgium supports the European Union ambition to stay a global frontrunner on gender equality and women and girls empowerment and the full enjoyment of all human rights by all women and girls. And this includes, in the State Secretary view, a firm opposition to any attempts to undermine existing international commitments and standards, and a firm defense of the agreed language, and in particular in relation to sexual and reproductive health rights. Access to sexual and reproductive health rights is a key to gender equality and reducing inequalities, and therefore critical to climate change adaptation and resilience. This is why Belgium is a committed donor to UNFPA and UN Women, as well as joining the Generation Equality Forum Coalition on sexual and health reproductive rights. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and thank you a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Alexander and Katarzyna, as well for the very illuminating policy proposals that are already being taken or still lie ahead. Now it's time for the Q&A. We have some people following online as well, but I suggest we first start with some questions in the room. If I can ask you to just raise your hand, be concise, and direct your question to a speaker. Thank you very much.
Apologies if this isn't like a world-shattering question. It's thank you so much to the last speaker for bringing up the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights. My name is Rashmi. I'm at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I've worked in international development on sexual and reproductive health and rights. I don't think we can avoid SRHR, specifically with an emphasis on the R on the end, the rights, when we talk about gender-based violence and the link with climate and water especially as well. How important do you see including that sector and advocating for a woman's right over her body and choice within these issues that you've all raised? And that's open to the panel.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So on my visits, my official country visits, I've actually been to sites that have been extensively exploited by companies, so by mining, gold mining or other kinds of extractive industries, and where we have seen very clearly the impact on women's reproductive and sexual health. So for example, in that one country, it showed up by miscarriages, very high number of miscarriages, also underdeveloped small kids, births, etc. So then it's clearly there. It's clearly one of those examples of a gendered impact. The problem is, as you know, that in the last few years, it's become more problematic to talk about sexual and reproductive health. There's been this pushback against that kind of language, including for adolescents and not just women. So then also that makes it harder to program, and it's going to make it more difficult to also support these activities in terms of funding, development funding. So we have a real problem, I would say, because it's one of the most essential services, but then becoming politically more sensitive. And then also if there are these disasters and crises that hit, it's going to be harder even to provide that service in these remote areas or disaster-struck areas. So yeah, one of the big challenges, yeah.
If I may add, a large part of the solution lies in education. There is a seat on the table, voice in the room, and power to be a decision maker. Why do I say that? I mean, there is a big experiment that was conducted in Bangladesh. For every 10 years, they used to take a survey of people who were engaged in the garment manufacturing industry, because the women were able to buy financial security. The first in 1990s, each woman had 4 children on an average. And after 10 years, 3, 2, 1. So the rights are, I think, are sort of, they take a long time, but I think the solution is within. We can apply external solutions, but empowerment through education is a big change, game changer. And I think maybe I'll pause here. The story says a lot.
I think it's definitely something we need to take into account. Again, coming back to the discussion of loss and damage, there's obviously the question of addressing loss and damage. If health centers, if women health centers are being ravaged by storms or by floods, then obviously we have an issue and we need to think about that. But also in the averting or minimizing the loss and damage, we need to make sure that makeshift health centers are made into robust health centers. And there's actually very good UN programs on that. The UNCDF local initiative is working on that in various continents, on very local responses on these issues, making sure that if there is a need for making health centers, women health centers, robust against these climate disasters, that these local authorities are giving the necessary funds to make that happen. And that's definitely something we need to think about and we need to work on further in the years to come. Belgium is also supporting these initiatives in various African countries, but it's an example, I just want to say, yeah.
I don't know, Colette or Katarzyna, do you want to also provide an answer to the audience question?
Yes, sure. So I think in South Africa, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that a great deal of health resources were diverted away from women's sexual rights and sexual reproductive health rights and health services, especially in rural areas. We also saw how during the hard lockdown, for example, women farm workers could not access these services. We've also seen when farm workers are evicted and moved to informal settlements that are not provisioned with these health services, women also lose out in that way. So we can see that there's an inevitable link between women's overall vulnerability and insecurity resulting from climate change and their ability to access these services, and also the fact that politicians and decision makers reprioritize resources. And so this is kind of therefore one set of health resources that will be diverted. But I also do want to come to the issue of education, because I think that that is critical in the long term. It does enhance women's agency. It does reduce their reliance, dependence on men, the ability to assert their sexual rights and independence, the ability to take part in political life, in political decisions about how resources, like resources around sexual and reproductive health rights are used. So that is, in the long term, the best solution.
Okay, if I may, to end up with a focus more on the rights, because you spoke a lot about the services. I think in the question was also the question of rights, and I would like to come back to that. And indeed, we see also the backlash that the Special Commissioner mentioned. So we are also in the moment of climate catastrophes, at the moment of backlash against women's rights, and this includes, of course, reproductive and sexual rights. So I think we have to also work on the level of international and nationally on the question of preserving those rights and presenting in legislation, and also backing the agreed language on the UN level, so not to go back on what we have already achieved on specific international agreements, because this is, as I said, often a question of populist politics that at the same time refuses to acknowledge the climate crisis, and as well works on taking back women's rights, and this specifically focuses on the rights of sexual and reproductive rights.
Any other questions from the audience?
Severine, of course.
Thank you. A very small one then, because I see signs. First, I just want to say that having a special rapporteur, having three politicians actually, civil society and scientists agreeing on something that seems so obvious, while we know that they are discussing gender issues in the COP and then cannot agree to really go forward, it strikes me. And I just feel that something is wrong and we should go out of this room and enter the negotiations and telling them, okay, we know what we have to do. But the small question is, and I'm sorry because it's really Belgian based, we have had huge flooding in Belgium last summer. And I know that even in Belgium, a rich country, we don't have specific information about violence against women occurring around this episode. Although we know that it has been the case, and our government have mentioned it, but we cannot even in Belgium have proper information. So my first question to my ministers, is that right? We don't have very much insight on that issue. And maybe to the others, do you have good examples of some country who have this kind of specific data? Thank you. And it was not so short.
Katarzyna, if you first want to answer this question.
Sure. So thank you, Severine, for the question. Indeed, bring the perspective also of the floodings in Belgium, because this was probably the first time that we realized that we're not saved in our north part of the globe, and I think it was also a very important moment for Belgium, but also Germany, to realize on how climate crisis will impact also Europe. But definitely we have some data about gender-based violence and climate crisis. Those are not Belgian data, but I recently read the Lancet article where there was an analysis of different scientific articles linking gender-based violence and climate crisis episodes, and definitely we have to also do it in Belgium specifically. We of course have data on gender-based violence, but they're not that granular, and would have to run a specific study that would be related to this event. But we know in general from other scientific studies that unfortunately this is linked, and this definitely happens because women and girls are more vulnerable in those situations. And we already mentioned the situation of shelters, different people staying together. This is definitely a situation that can evolve in that way. But I would also join you, so we will have to do more to have more data, because this is the way that we can also be more persuasive about this link and put it on the table. So definitely with our gender-based violence plan, we strive to have more data on the table and more analysis, but also to work on a specific political action that will help to provide an answer and an emergency response that is gender sensitive.
So in the report I presented, there are references to some data that has come out from studies. There were studies done in, for example, following Haiyan cyclone in the Philippines, also Katrina, so it shows the gaps there. But I think it's precisely what you said, is that it offers an opportunity to really also, now that Belgium has gone through this, to also take stock of the gaps in the response, and of what went well, what needs to be done better for the future ones, because we all know there will be future ones. And no country is immune to these disasters. And in a way, it's maybe a blessing in disguise that climate crisis doesn't know any borders, so that we realize that we're all in this together, and that irrespective of whether we are global north, global south, or our resources, we all have challenges with the response and taking into consideration the specific needs and impact of women and girls. So I think it's an opportunity also to do evaluations, to try to figure out how do we have better data. And I just want to say, maybe one risk from the response to these big emergencies is that it gets very often, it's looked at from a security lens. And by that I mean, because of the scale, it usually gets delegated then to the army, law enforcement, you know, and there, of course, especially in specific countries, the human rights angle is not a strength, yeah, it's not a forte. You asked for specific examples. I think if you integrate more women in the leadership for the disaster mitigation and response and contingency planning, they will naturally take these issues into consideration, right? Because they are women. So Cuba, for example, despite the fact that it's under sanctions and despite all the challenges it has, for example, developed a very good system of including many women in the leadership for the disaster risk and reduction and early warning centers. So that has really improved the kind of responses that they have in place.
Thank you. Maybe I take the opportunity to share that as United Nations University in Belgium, along with our sister organizations in Netherlands and Germany, we responded to the European floods last year in July 2021, and we launched our initiative, Climate Resilience Initiative, and in that particular initiative we defined a work package on community resilience. And within that work package there is a strong focus on understanding the impacts of climate change and disaster events on mental health. And mental health, why? Because of the stress. Maybe in Belgium and in most of the countries in global north, there are early warning systems, there are financial compensation mechanisms, there is disaster risk insurance, but the kind of turmoil people feel after seeing a kind of aftermath of a disaster, it needs a bit of a trauma counseling, it needs some kind of amplified climate services to give them a transition from fear to hope, to acknowledge the solidarity that people came together and helped each other. And I think people are sometimes not able to recognize the responses that they feel. As a response of stress, violence could be the next phase. So I think even irrespective of the borders, we are trying to understand how mental health, psychosocial well-being could be addressed through amplified climate services, and we're doing that right in Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. Taking that example, we'll also scale it in Global South. I'll take one more example just to give you some context about part 2 of your question. Having lived in Canada, I would never even have imagined that we would have cases of domestic violence from heat waves. In the August of 2020, the domestic violence call reached a peak of 500 times more than average annual months. This was a warning call for civic protection agencies, especially the local police. They were always on the duty for understanding this. And then we had to work with academia and psychologists and therapists to understand why this sudden rise in domestic violence, and it was attributed to heat wave. When you don't have systems in place in your household or in your community to understand the response that you are having because of climate stress, you don't even know why you're getting violent. So I think what government did, our community organized cool camps. So the churches, the community centers were converted into air conditioning units where people can come and cool off, and they can sort of reflect, they can get some guidance, there are some brochures, there are some people to help. So I think there were some interventions that have been put into place as we are able to diagnose we are able to put direct and indirect causality to consequences.
Thank you. I have to sadly wrap this Q&A already up. Sorry, it's my role as a moderator to be very annoying. And I would like to give the floor to Viviane for some end conclusions. And I'm sorry also for the questions for the people following online. If there were any raised, we'll try to collect them and see how we proceed further. But thank you for staying with us. Viviane?
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending physically and virtually online. I would like to thank all the participants, of course, but I would also like to thank the help we have for the organization of this event, because you know it never goes without saying, but the people who work hard on this, and I would like to thank Kiki Berkers, I would like to thank Alba Perez-Terran. In Brussels, I would like to thank Wiske Jules, and I would also like to thank our acting president, Katinka Inzant, for all this organization and making this possible today. I would like to take with us maybe 2 or 3 important things that have been said today. First of all, remember that we have sufficient data, as you said, to know that climate change exacerbates violence against women and girls, and that it comes in different forms, in different places, with different faces, and that it affects women's human rights. Also, take a recommendation that's very important, and as Séverine said, that we all share here, is that we need comprehensive policies for gender-based violence and climate at the same time. And this is really very important, and it resonates with what Colette has been said regarding women on farms, that employment, tenure, the loss of those confronts and leads to violence with partners, but also in the environments. And so we really need to link this all the time and at the same time to be able to confront it. Also, the link and work on education in light of the Beijing Declaration, and work on the unpaid economy. All this is linked together, and working on these different aspects will help go forward. And then maybe also remind us through the participation of both ministers at our conference that gender-specific laws and indicators, all this together are essential for a gender-based approach. And maybe also remind us through the examples of the work with our partner countries. In Congo, for instance, with the reports we have on violence against women, how it is important and how we need to stress the need for protection and a safer environment, and also go and prosecute the perpetrators. But also in line with the work coming with Mozambique, how it is important to go for a better mapping of the needs of the aftermath crisis we have had in different countries, and so that's very important. Integrate the measures and engage women and girls at all levels. So this is very important, and the final word, I would say, if we want to combat and continue combating the backlashes, and and continue to fight for our rights, women's rights, then we have to be able not to hijack the issue on women's rights and go forward on fighting also the negative coping mechanisms and work on the aftermaths of the crisis. So let's all work together on all that and go forward on women's rights and climate change and gender-based violence. Thank you very much.